Leaders in times of recession or in time of troubles have an added responsibility, and the call on them to step up is even higher than in normal times.
The ability to see that in spite of great difficulties, this period too shall pass. Really what much of the attention needs to be focused on is not just the very short term and the pain involved in the short term, but the shape of the future. What will the world look like? What will my industry look like? What will the nature of regulation look like? So the capacity to be optimistic, but also to be forward-looking in a very thoughtful way is an extremely important part of what we should expect from leaders around the world today.
In times such as these, leaders are going to have to show that they are bold, that they are flexible in reaching out a solution, that they are visionary, that they're not just concerned with what's going to happen in the next year or two, but rather looking forward in terms of what will it take to get their institutions or their corporations to be successful in the next 5, 10 or 15 years. They've got to be honest and transparent, tell the truth as it is, and prepare their stakeholders for what's to come.
The major issues of our time are inherently global. Issues of trade, of migration, of financial markets, demographics, and carbon. And these require a level of global citizenship from leaders that is unprecedented. A foundational premise of thinking that has guided prosperity and growth over the last 20 years has been a general acceptance of market forces, and corresponding to that, a general decline in protectionism around the world. On both of these questions today, we see a very rapid retreat, and in fact, countries that have been seen as originating this kind of thinking on the global platform, largely in North America and Western Europe, have seen very large-scale nationalizations, particularly in the financial services sector, but also quite substantial financial assistance to companies in sectors that can hardly be described as strategic. And that retreat, ideological retreat, poses very big questions for emerging markets, which in their own turn have over this time sought, at varying degrees, to liberalize and generally deregulate markets.
Market capitalism has to be balanced with the concerns of various stakeholders. It cannot be about the pursuit of profit maximization alone at all cost.
The very big question is what set of voices and what governing premises will drive the world over the next couple of decades. And we sincerely hope that we do not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Market capitalism has proven that it is quite a resilient, economic system, and it will not disappear despite the current backlash against it.
The ethical and moral issues here, of course, are dramatic, because what this crisis demonstrates is the extraordinary interconnectedness of the world. It would seem crucial that the institutional response, whether from companies or from governments, recognizes that interconnectedness, and the responsibility that institutions carry, not only for the well-being of in the first instance, the managers of these companies, but then their shareholders, and because of the impact of large global institutions in the world, their impact on the world at large.
Corporations have a duty, and chief executives have a duty to maximize profits for for their shareholders, but this has to be balanced with environmental concerns, the concerns of the communities where these corporations operate, the concerns and the imperatives, development imperatives of the countries where corporations develop activities, so on and so forth. So yes, there has to be some balance brought into the system. It can be done through a variety of ways, and not regulation only, as some are calling for.
Never before in human history has there been a phase where the acute connection between corporate responsibility for not only returns and adequate compensation for managers, but for their responsibilities to the world at large. I don't think we've seen a time in history where that connection is more acute or more necessary. I'd point to three features that will inevitably be a major part of what happens with governance around financial institutions. The first of these in the short to medium term is the very rapid escalation of the role of government in these institutions. An abiding feature of this is that the government will participate and exercise certain prerogatives as an important shareholder in these institutions, which will be not just the maximization of shareholder wealth, but also very material issues such as liquidity and the preservation of stability in financial systems. A second major feature of financial governance that we would advocate is a much tighter connection between risk-taking, capital allocation, and executive compensation structure. For regulators, the blind spot in much that has happened in regulatory change in the last 10 years has been around incentive compensation and its connection to risk-taking and capital allocation. And I think regulators will need to acquire a certain level of sophistication in that sort of microeconomic understanding of incentives and managerial behavior as a consequence of those incentives. And these skills will need development, to say the least. The third aspect of financial regulation, which I think is quite important, is to understand that most regulatory structures today are national. And not only are many of the major institutions global, but certainly when it comes to their transaction relationships, especially in capital markets, these are cross-border and certainly multinational at least. The migration towards multilateralism in policy and regulation is very important when it comes to where financial markets go. And those institutions today are untested, and indeed today are more in the nature of forums rather than formal institutions. Environment and climate change more generally is the most important issue that confronts the world today. And this is so for two reasons. One is that it is perhaps the most difficult game theory problem the world has ever confronted. Because what is good for me individually is not good for all of us collectively. We all know that, but nevertheless the logic of this is that I continue to sort of maximize my national self-interest in spite of its impact on the planet. And the second aspect of this, of course, is that this is the most long-tail problem that the world has ever confronted, because by its very nature, the impacts of climate change will not be felt even in the next generation, but really will be over the next 30 or 40 years, so 2 generations out.
The environmental issues that we face are real, and no recession should take them off the table. So my hope is that corporations and political leaders, as they look for ways to come out of the recession, will not do that at the expense of key environmental issues such as, carbon or biofuels or food security or others. Nobody's really seriously debating the science of climate change very much anymore. But the solutions are much more difficult to come by and require both a level of multilateralism in the search for solutions and leadership within that multilateralism, particularly from the United States, but also require innovation in how solutions will be found to this on a scale that has never been achieved in the world. We all have to hope, being all common owners of our community's environment, that the environmental concerns that have become high on the agenda of political and corporate leaders over the last few years do not drop to become a priority number 10. Recessions come and go, but the challenges of global warming are here to stay. And to that extent, what has been encouraging is some of the discussion, particularly in the United States more recently, about linking fiscal strategies to provide stimulus to the economy more directly to the long-term issues around the world, including around climate change. The search for solutions around a problem that has catastrophic implications over the next 40 to 50 years cannot be stymied by this recession, because indeed over the lifetime of the search and implementation of these solutions, other recessions will come. There is a widespread sense that the origins of this crisis are quite localized, and problems of, in the worst case, naked greed in a small number of large financial institutions are the origins of a
crisis of global scale.
The corporate sector needs to demonstrate its commitment to being a good corporate citizen.
The restoration of a level of confidence in institutions, in corporate institutions, but in particular in financial institutions, is perhaps the number one imperative.
All the initiatives that corporations have adopted over the last few years meant at demonstrating their commitment to their communities, to their environment, to the countries where they operate. My hope is that corporations will maintain those kinds of commitments and investments.
In order to make that happen, I think boards will have to recognize that their constituents are not merely their sort of human capital within the organization or their shareholders, but the world at large.
Rather than talk about regulation, I'd rather talk of smart regulation. My hope is that corporations will take the lead in proposing, in fact, some of those smart regulations and working hand in hand with all stakeholders to get those smart regulations in place where they are necessary.
Without an internalization by boards and senior managements, particularly of financial institutions, of that responsibility, I think it is going to be difficult to imagine confidence returning anytime soon. The world is in recession. We're going to see, in our view, a period of the next 3 to 4 quarters of negative numbers in certainly Europe and North America, but also quite dramatic slowing down in major emerging markets.
For the next year or two, households and corporations are going to have to go through a deleveraging process and get their financial positions back in good standing. This will have profound impact on investment levels on one hand, but also on consumption levels, and the corporate world is going to have to adjust to this reality. Some countries like the US are expected to emerge quicker from this recession than others, but it's not going to be a short one. It's not a matter of a few months. It's my view is it's going to be at least a year or two to get back to a position where everyone feels a bit more comfortable. For other countries, the process of going through the recession and emerging out of it may take a bit longer than that.
The clean out of the scale of these problems is going to take several years. And over that period of time, whilst growth will return, we would expect companies to continue to be cautious, as will governments and regulators. Over a 5-year horizon, nevertheless, the core underlying drivers of the world economy, which we continue to be the expansion of middle classes in major countries around the world, will be the dominant feature, and indeed will be for the next decade. One of a small number of consulting firms that are global partners of the World Economic Forum. We believe strongly in its agenda around the importance of global conversation on issues that matter, as well as the importance of the regional forums that have been so successful in mobilizing opinion and thought leadership around the world. We are, for example, co-chairing the India Forum next year. The major areas at the level of the World Economic Forum itself have been related to climate change, an issue that we are very deeply concerned with, and of course have invested a great deal by way of the generation of intellectual capital. The connection between the automotive industry generally and biofuels, alternative energy sources, as well as the impacts of the travel and tourism industry on climate, have been areas that we have collaborated with the Forum and will continue to do so.